The affirmative speeches have failed to come to terms with three arguments. I'll start with these because I think that we win the debate on these unanswered arguments alone. First, how do we decide which culture is authentic and good and which culture is overly commercialized and bad? Who made them the arbiters of culture? Why is pop art less authentic than traditional dance, music, or sculpture? I happen to like pop art. This is where our arguments about UNESCO come into play. Yes, in theory, we shouldn't give culture solely commercial value, but in practice, these decisions are hard. These decisions are messy. These decisions are often self-serving, and they are very easily manipulated. No exception at all is preferable to an arbitrary exception. Ask yourself, when during either of the affirmative speeches did they explain how we value culture outside of market forces? Liberalization and globalization are by no means perfect, but the alternative is too vague and abstract to risk. Allow me to clarify our position. We are not saying that cultural goods should be valued solely economically by individuals or even by you, the judge. What we are saying is that for governments and international institutions, cultural goods, activities, and services should be included in the economic frameworks that regulate all aspects of global commerce. This is to say, cultural products should not be exempted from the rules of free trade. The affirmative would like you to interpret the resolution ambiguously, perhaps that culture is good for religious reasons or aesthetic reasons, end of story. But they don't want to address how this statement might be actualized or implemented. The resolution did not appear out of thin air. It is a core part of the 2001 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity. We are not saying that their position is merely similar to this UNESCO convention, nor their position literally is the UNESCO convention. Consider the topic statement, conveniently available on the Lafayette Debate Wiki. It reads as follows. The UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expression describes the complex relationship between globalization, cultural activities, goods, and services. Thus, the explicit objectives of the conventions include reaffirming the sovereign rights of states to maintain, adopt, and implement policies and measures that they deem appropriate for the protection and promotion of the diversity of cultural expressions on their territory. Selected for the purpose of examining these observations and objectives, the resolution for the Lafayette Debates 2013-2014 is resolved: cultural activities, goods, and services should not be treated as solely having commercial value. The affirmative's facile deflection of convention is absurd. We can all agree that culture is valuable for lots of reasons, but for the purpose of this debate, cultural goods are entangled in a dispute over the scope of international trade, which is at stake in the UNESCO Convention and ongoing trade negotiations between the US and European Union. As the Wall Street Journal reports, negotiating a trade and investment deal between the US and European Union originally seemed largely a technical discussion over tariffs and regulations, has mushroomed into something far broader, a debate over the threat that American mass-market entertainment poses to European culture. The hottest topic, officials say, will be the cultural exception to international trade rules that let nations subsidize domestically produced movies, television shows, and radio programs in order to preserve local culture. The second argument that I do not think the affirmative has come to terms with, which is that Jackie completely ignored Danny's very smart arguments about subcultures and minorities within nation states. They had a lot to say about interstate cultural disputes, but literally nothing about intra-states. If the government of each country can decide the value of culture outside of more objective market forces, these decisions will always exclude as much as they protect. This is why champions of the cultural exception like France can ban the wearing of the hijab. Canada can regulate anyone hunting rituals in the name of environmentalism, while cloaking this cultural genocide under the veneer of protecting Francophone or Anglophone culture. Globalization offers more hope for these diasporas, like Muslims in France, and subnational minorities like First Nations in Canada, because they control the means and outcome of cultural production. The last speech was also very light on our arguments about communal ownership of property. The very matrix of the economy is necessary for the preservation of culture. They have an overly simplistic, overly individualized understanding of cultural commodification. For some peoples, land and cultural production has always been a collective enterprise and should be recognized as such. In fact, in the words of Dr. Albaro, international frameworks have been used as opportunities for states to solidify the institutional framework of the role of culture in reproduction of nationhood. He explains we should have good reasons to be suspicious of national cultural projects, as historically they have been mounted regular assaults on the internal diversity of states in the interest of the nation. We need only recall a widespread and centuries-long strategy of nation building. In the nation-building mode, culture has been used to articulate an arrangement of a set of people with a shared set of beliefs in a particular place. In the process, cultural minorities often find themselves to be spatially incarcerated. One serious question about the Cultural Diversity Treaty is whether UNESCO can redress the historical disenfranchisement of cultural minority communities worldwide. Third, the crux of our argument is that market forces are the least bad choice. A few concessions here as well. First, any exception for culture becomes a loophole to be manipulated by domestic industry at the expense of global utility. What starts as legitimate exceptions, the ones that they have pointed out, becomes a slippery slope where any industry can be seen as part of any country's particular culture. Second, we have already lived in the world the affirmative proposes. It's called mercantilism. It stifles innovation, creativity, and expression far more than globalization. And third, I think this is the most important part. They are simply on the wrong side of history. Jackie concedes that liberalization is largely inevitable. We cannot turn back the clock. The question is if we make market forces work, or if we give nations tools like the cultural exception to slow and manipulate the process of liberalization. Even if protectionism is likely in the future, we should minimize the opportunity. We believe that one of the most important consequences of the affirmative's view is that it justifies government subsidization and protection of culture. The problem with these policies is that they are what are often called non-tariff barriers. The cultural sector should not be exempt from the process of eliminating these barriers. The affirmative claims that protectionism has other causes, that trade has bigger problems. The examples that they name are as the real problems in trade negotiations are sectors focused on the bottom line. Newsflash, the French subsidize their film industry to protect the bottom line. Government intervention to support cultural goods is a non-tariff barrier to trade. Now, as a final point of conclusion, we have made three arguments. The resolution asks us to determine the cultural value of cultural production. You can't do that in a non-arbitrary way, which means the market is a better mechanism. Second, they have completely glossed over subcultures and minorities within nations. And third, they become a convenient excuse to slow the process of globalization, which offers the best chance possible for people to advance themselves and their culture.